welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, episode 6. We are starting out this time with Cannibalize. 1 and a black sorcery. Choose 2 target creatures controlled by the same player. Exile one of those creatures and put 2 +1/+1 counters on the other. Very interesting removal spell, and I know removal is so fantastic in the format. Why would you ever play this one? Well, because it's versatile, and I like versatile cards, and in particular, I like cards that you can play on yourself or on your opponents given the right situation. Now, of course, if I'm in the situation where my opponent's got a Blightsteel Colossus, I'll just exile that and put 2 counters on any of their, who cares, right? I'm just getting rid of a Blightsteel Colossus for 2 mana. That seems totally worth it. And if I give my opponent's creatures a couple of counters, what do I care about that, right? This is also an interesting fit in a Volroth the Shapestealer deck because, of course, until your next turn, Volroth becomes a copy of target creature with a counter on it. And of course, your commander does put counters on creatures, but you want other ways to put counters on creatures. So this is a pretty neat fit there where I can exile my opponent's commander or whatever their best creature is, put a couple counters on the creature that I want to be copying. So it's a really neat fit in a deck like that as well. But you can also use it on yourself. It is a way to put counters on your own creatures as well. I really like this in a Nadir deck, and I will be putting it in my own Nadir deck for that reason. Again, this is another situation of, why didn't I have that in there before? It seems like a great fit. So of course, you're going to have lots of token creatures lying around with your Nadir deck, and of course, Nadir says whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, which of course includes exile. So if I say have an elf token sitting there, I can cannibalize it. That will trigger my commander because it's a token leaving the battlefield, put a counter on my commander, and then of course I use the Cannibalize to also put 2 counters on it. So this is 2 mana, put 3 +1/+1 counters on your Nadir. So pretty great fit in that deck. It's a pretty neat card. It is a decent removal spell and also a versatile one as well. Let's talk about Call of the Wild. 2 green enchantment. Pay 2 green. Reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your graveyard. I'm surprised this card doesn't see more play. I know a lot of people will say 8 mana to put a creature into play. I mean, not really, but I guess the first creature is going to be 8 mana, and then the second one is 4, and so on down the line, right? I mean, obviously, you were just going to play this in a deck where you are looking at the top card of your library a lot. There is a bunch of commanders that are doing that, right? I guess it also puts stuff in your graveyard. There might be a reason you want to do that. If you want non-creature things going to your graveyard, like lands, for example, maybe you're in a lands deck, like a Gitrog deck. I mean, this might not seem like a great fit in a Gitrog deck, but it actually does work. Reveal the top card of my library. If it's a land, it goes into my graveyard and I get to draw a card off my Gitrog, and also I probably want land cards in my graveyard. And if it's a creature, of course, it goes into play, so it's all upside for me. But mostly I think, there's quite a few commanders out there in green that are looking at the top of their libraries all the time, or you're going to be putting stuff into your deck that is looking at the top of your library, or reshuffling the top of your library because you want to manipulate the top of your deck. This seems like a pretty great fit there, right? Just really nice value. 4 mana, put a creature directly into play. Not bad. Another card I'm really surprised doesn't see more play is Carnival of Souls. 1 and a black enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you lose 1 life and add a black. And I guess this can be a bit of a dangerous card, I suppose, because you can't really control it, and it works on your opponents as well, right? This is when any creature enters the battlefield, you lose a life and you add a black. So the lose life part can be a little dangerous. Obviously, the mana part is great. This is an enchantment that sits on the battlefield that is constantly churning out mana. You can obviously get into some really crazy combo-y situations with this. If I'm in a black-white life gain deck, because I'm gaining life all the time, the lose life part I probably care even less about than I already would in a commander game. Obviously, you can get into some combo-y situations where you're just having lots of tokens enter the battlefield, add black mana, use that to cast more creatures or make more token creatures from whatever that thing is that's making you token creatures. If you have some sort of a mana sink, like you have something you can put the mana into on your opponent's turns, I think it's extra good, right? Because of course your opponents are going to be playing creatures, and when they do, you'll get a black mana and you don't want it to go to waste. You want to use it for something. So having something you can dump that mana into is also great. And extra good fit for a card like this. I also like it in a Toshiro Umezawa deck. The reason why is because, of course, that deck's going to be loaded up with instants. You're going to have a whole bunch of instants in that deck. So, of course, again, that mana you're getting on your opponent's turns from them playing creatures is going to get you mana that you can use to cast your instants. Really neat card, very unique for sure in that it is an enchantment sort of ritual effect and probably can go in a lot of decks. Let's talk about Caller of the Hunt. 2 and a green, human, just human, no longer a lord. This is just a plain old human. It's not a ranger or a scout or a druid or anything like that. It's just a human and just has some very weird wording here. As an additional cost to cast this spell, choose a creature type. Wow, that's weird wording. I mean, obviously not the original wording, but they made it so that you have to choose a creature type as you cast this, I guess, because of course it has that star as the power toughness. And if you don't choose a creature type, then it comes into play without having a power toughness. Just very weird wording, I guess they had to put on this card. So you're going to choose a creature type as you cast it, obviously. And unsurprisingly, it has power and toughness each equal to the number of creatures of the chosen type on the battlefield. So of course, this can go in a tribal deck. The weird thing here is it's just a human. So of course, I guess you can put it in those human tribal decks in green. Probably is a decent fit there. I guess it is just a big vanilla creature, which isn't super fantastic. But again, we have this card where I can actually use this depending on what my opponents are doing, right? It's kind of a funny way to use a card like this. You just look at the board and whatever is the most popular creature type, you just choose that. It doesn't have to be what you're playing. So if I'm playing against my buddy's zombie tribal deck, which is really powerful, and obviously he's always got a lot of zombies in play, I'll choose zombie for my Caller of the Hunt, and my Caller of the Hunt will come in with power and toughness equal to the number of zombies in play, right? So that's why I think this can be a real fun, interesting card where if I got guys in my play groups that like their goblin tribal, elf tribal, zombie tribal decks, and they're playing them all the time, I can just very easily get a 3-mana 10/10 creature, which I think is pretty good. Seta Sanctuary coming up next at number 5. 2 and a blue enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a red or green permanent, draw a card, then discard a card. So you get a free loot on your upkeep. Not bad if you control a red or green permanent. However, if you control a red permanent and a green permanent, instead draw 2 cards, then discard a card. That's much better, right? So if I am in a teamer deck, let's just talk about that scenario. So I'm in a teamer deck. I have, just say, my commander, which is probably likely red, blue, and green. I am now controlling a red permanent and I am controlling a green permanent because, of course, it counts as both. On my upkeep, I get to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. Seems pretty good, right? Really great value out of this. Just draw 2 extra cards every turn and then discard something I don't want. I guess if you're in a discard theme, it's extra good, or if there's some stuff you want in your graveyard, extra good. Just a really easy slot in, good card advantage in any teamer deck, I think. Let's move on to Carrion, coming in at number 6. 1 black instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. Create X01 black insect creature tokens, where X is the sacrifice creature's power. Again, one of my favorite sack outlets in the format. And again, another card I have in my Nadir deck because, of course, it's a slam dunk there. I want to be sacrificing my commander, and the power of my commander also matters, of course. And this is just a great way to churn out tons of tokens that I want in that deck. Obviously, instant speed, of course, is really important in those situations. They're old ones, but who cares? There's lots of decks out there that sort of are these token matters decks where you just want lots of tokens in play. Obviously, there's also a lot of decks that just want to be sacrificing creatures, like all those aristocrats decks. This seems like a great fit. And also, they are insects, right? This card has been errated. They are no longer maggots. They are insects, so might fit in your insect tribal deck as well. Keep that in mind. Let's move on to Centaur Omen Reader. 3 and a green, snow creature, Centaur Shaman. So this is a snow creature. That might be relevant. It's a 3/3, and as long as Centaur Omen Reader is tapped, creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. That seems pretty good. So obviously, just having all your creatures cost 2 less to cast is fantastic. Of course, it's got to be tapped, but there is likely a lot of situations where you can just attack with it, right? That's obviously the easiest way to tap a creature. It is a 3/3, so it's decently sized. It's a pretty good chance, I would say, that you will have an opponent that you can attack with a 3/3 creature and not have it die in combat. And then on your second main phase, it's now tapped. tapped and all your creatures are 2 cheaper. That seems fantastic. But of course, extra good in a deck where you can be tapping down your creatures. And there's a lot of decks that are doing that, right? If you have some effect like a Glare of Subdual that is tapping down your own creatures, of course, you don't even have to worry about that part. It just happens automatically. There are decks that are doing that theme. Maybe you want to throw this in your Archelos Lagoon Mystic deck because likely you're doing the tapping, untapping theme in some regard there. Obviously, if your commander's tapped, Centaur Omen Reader will enter the battlefield tapped, so you already got that part covered. Might be a neat fit in that deck as well. Also a snow creature, so if you're in that snow tribal deck as well, might be an easy slot in because you're already doing that. Pretty neat card, I think. Let's talk about Cataran Summons. 1 black mana sorcery. Search your library for a mercenary card, reveal that card, and put in your hand, then shuffle. So obviously, if you are playing Mercenary Tribal, this card is an auto-include in your deck. Am I right? I don't know how many people are doing that. I will say though, when I first mentioned this card on this series, obviously nobody was doing Mercenary Tribal because they're not great. However, Mercenaries did get revisited in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. There are actually commanders that are doing that. They've added a lot of mercenaries to the game of Magic because of that set, obviously. Vile Smasher Gleeful Grenadier. Whenever another outlaw enters the battlefield under your control, deals 1 damage to target opponent. And of course, an outlaw is a grouping of creatures that does include mercenaries. So that deck is a deck that you might want to include Cataran Summons in. However, where I really like this card is in that Changeling Tribal or Omni Tribal deck. If you're at all doing that, the Ur-Dragon is the second most popular commander in the entire format. And I think part of the reason why, obviously a lot of people just doing Dragon Tribal, but a lot of people are doing that Changeling Tribal or Omni Tribal deck where you have a lot of changelings in there. And Cataran Summons is 1 mana, search your library for any changeling and put it into your hand, right? And in fact, it's even a changeling card, so you can even go get your crib swap with a Cataran Summons if you want to. If you're doing a Maskwood Nexus type of deck, which is going to turn all the creatures in your deck into mercenaries. Again, Cataran Summons now is 1 black mana, get any creature out of your deck. So in those specific themes, it might be a really great option for tutoring in your deck. I mean, 1 black mana doesn't get much better than that for a tutor, right? Give it some consideration for a deck like that. Let's talk about a newer card. In fact, one that just came out last year, Callforth The Tempest, came out in the Lord of the Rings special edition Christmas set, whatever the heck it was called. It came out right before Christmas last year, and I think a lot of people are not aware of it. I already talked about a bunch of cards from it on my channel. This one I missed though, and I actually think it's pretty darn good. 5 red sorcery, has Cascade, so the double Cascade, and of course, if you're already in the Cascade Tribal deck, or you're in the Cast from Exile, or Cast from Anywhere Other Than Your Hand, all those different themes, of course, Cascade works in those decks, so that would be an extra good place where you would play this card, but I think you could put this in any deck, and it's going to be great for you. Callforth The Tempest deals damage to each creature your opponents control equal to the total mana value of other spells you've cast this turn. So you're going to cast this for 8, and of course, it's going to deal damage to each creature your opponents control, so it is a one-sided board wipe, which for 8 mana, I know 8 mana seems like a lot, but I think it is totally worth it to completely wipe your opponent's board and save all your creatures, right? You look at a Plague Wind, there's a card that people play in the Commander format that just destroys all your opponent's creatures and not yours. That costs 9 mana. And Callforth The Tempest will, I think, very likely kill all your opponent's creatures and leave yours behind. And then on top of that, you get the Cascade. So of course, I have to explain why this is going to kill your opponent's creatures. Likely, of course, it's looking for the total mana value of other spells you've cast this turn, and it's doing that as it resolves. So of course it will include the cards you have cascaded into. If you've cast other stuff earlier in the turn, of course it gets even better, but because it's 8 mana, that's likely not going to happen. I mean, it's a possibility, but likely you're just going to cast this for 8 mana, cascade into 2 different cards, and maybe one of them is like an Arcane Signet that's only 2 damage, but the other one is like maybe a 4 or 5 mana card. Now we're up to 7 damage for all of our opponent's creatures, which probably likely will kill them all. all. So for 8 mana, I am getting an Arcane Signet and a 5-drop into play, and I'm also killing all my opponent's creatures. That seems pretty good, right? That's some pretty fantastic value for a red board wipe, I think. We will end off today with Celestial Dawn. Very, very unique card. I always got to mention the cards that have these incredibly unique and very powerful effects. 1 white enchantment. Lands you control are planes. So already we have a very powerful effect here. All your lands are going to be planes. This is only affecting you, of course. All your lands turn into planes just like you would with a Blood Moon, where it turns them into mountains. They are no longer what they were before. This is doing that with your lands, which of course means they all tap for white mana as well. Non-land permanents you control are white. Of course, your lands are planes, so you have planes and you have white permanents. The same is true for spells you control and non-land cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color. You may spend other mana as though it were colorless mana. So this card is just doing so much, right? It's turning your lands into planes. It's turning your permanents into white permanents, if you want to be doing that for whatever reason. Your spells are now white as well. That is very unique. There's not a lot of cards that do that, right? Painter's Servant, I think, would be the only one that actually turns spells into certain colors, at least continuously. And of course, it more or less mana fixes you because you can just use white mana or mana of any color. And since all your lands are planes, that means your lands are essentially adding mana of any color. Where specifically do you want to play this? That is the interesting part. Obviously, because this card is doing a lot of really niche places where it would fit, you honestly could put this in any deck just to mana fix you. You know, you could put this in a 5-color deck, and what it essentially does is make it so that your lands tap for any mana because they're all planes, which means they all add white mana, which means your white mana can be used as mana of any color. So you can use it that way. It is just a great way to mana fix. It does shut off, though, your non-basic lands, right? If you have like a Scavenger Grounds or a Ghost Quarter or something like that, they are now planes, so you can't use them to do what you normally would want to do with them. So that can be a downside. It's a really powerful effect, right? It's a really unique one as well. You guys let me know if you're playing this card. How are you using it? Why is it in your deck? I'm actually really curious, but it certainly is a very unique card with a really powerful effect, and I gotta give it a mention on this series. That is it for today. 10 more cards that I think you guys should be considering for your commander decks. Really unique, interesting ones. Some of them might seem underwhelming, but I think they might be great fits in your deck. That is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.